Hey, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Jake Milstein. Today, we're going to be discussing vulnerabilities and cyber attacks in Microsoft Azure. Some of you might pronounce it Azure, and you're wrong. It's Azure. I checked with Microsoft. So just like ground rules is we're against people calling it Azure. So that's a very important thing. Number two is as we get people in the room here, and I burn some time. A very important thing is so I run marketing. I just created these new sweatshirts, and Jeremy's wearing one, and I'm wearing one. And at the very end, we'll have a survey, and of the people who fill out the survey, I will send somebody a sweatshirt, or maybe if you ask me just really nicely, I'll send you a sweatshirt because they're really good and warm, which is good because I'm in the office today and the air conditioning's on, as one does in Seattle in December. Anyway, welcome everybody. The point today is not to talk about sweatshirts and not talk about all that, but some ground rules, which is we have Jeremy today. He's going to do the presentation. On the right-hand side of the screen, you have a chat. The platform here has changed its look a little bit. So you might have to click on a window on the bottom right to get the chat up. But open the chat up, because if you have questions as we're going, put them in the chat. I'll interrupt Jeremy and Mike and make sure that we get your questions in. It's important to us that we do. These are always much better when y'all ask a lot of questions. With that, we're going to do introductions next. Then we'll have Jeremy's presentation. We'll do Q&A. And then at the end, we'll have the survey. And we really appreciate when folks stay around for the survey. The survey does three things. Number one, it tells us how we did. And we take that feedback seriously, and we improve our events based on your feedback. Number two is in the survey, you have a chance, you can either get a gift card for filling it out, or you can donate your gift card to a food bank, which especially this time of year is very important. And lastly, as I mentioned, I'm going to give out a sweatshirt, which is something that is so well thought through. I thought of it about 4 minutes ago. Very important. Do me a favor, put in the chat where in the world you're joining from. We love to know where folks are. And with that, Jeremy is the director of Adversary, Replication, and Detection. He was our lead penetration tester for a long time. And he has spent a ton of time trying to break into Azure so that our Security Operations Center can do a better job defending attacks and spotting attacks in Azure, and our penetration testers can do a better job, breaking into it. And he, of course, works with us here at Critical Insight, where we do SOC as a service called Managed Detection Response. We do penetration testing. We do risk assessments. We do all sorts of things. Mike Simon's our Chief Technology Officer. He's made a whole career out of breaking into things and then helping organizations prevent that from happening. He says it more eloquently, but it's kind of who he is. And then I'm the event host, and I run marketing and am in charge of the sweatshirts. Jeremy is going to take it away here for part of what he's learned about Azure, and then we're going to do Q&A. So put your questions in the chat as we go. Jeremy, all yours.
Hey, thank you, Jake. Today we're going to talk about Microsoft Azure, maybe not so much O365, Office 365. That's a productivity suite, including Outlook, Teams, Office. And while those services are connected and in some ways deeply intertwined, I'm not talking about that specifically. What we are going to talk about today is the Azure Resource Manager and some of the stuff under Azure, like classic cloud kind of infrastructure. So it'd be like VMs, serverless. So if you think of like Kubernetes as an example, blob storage, databases, Azure has over 200 different services as part of its product suite. I'm not going to obviously talk about all of them. I'm going to talk about a subset of those. Next slide, please. So today, when we talk about Azure Security Management, when I talk about this, I'm going to focus on three specific things. And this is from Microsoft's own categorization of how they think about security. They think about identity and access, secure the network, safeguard data, key secrets and certificate, centralized visibility and prevention. So we're going to talk about the three things in green: identity and access, securing the network, and centralized visibility and prevention. We're going to start this out talking about what's like an overview of what some of the product is. We're going to talk about that centralized visibility and prevention, so what the detection and the alerts look like, and then we're going to roll into attacks next. So to kind of give an overview, because I don't know where everybody is at, and we're just gonna like all be on the same playing field here. I'm gonna go over these different Azure products so that we're kind of all talking about the same thing. And that's actually a really good point to bring up, in that Microsoft over the past year, 6 months, the last 3 months, they've been changing names. And so as I've been trying to learn about this and stay up to speed with it, it's also been a little bit of whack-a-mole with what Microsoft is calling a thing today. So MCAS, Microsoft Cloud App Security, is now Defender for Cloud Apps, as an example. And so that's where, like, this should be the most recent and up-to-date version, unless they change something in the last couple of weeks. But this should be the most up-to-date, and I want to get these terms level set so that we're all talking about the same thing. And then something else to keep in mind is that Microsoft views Azure Cloud in kind of two specific ways. One is hybrid and one is cloud only. And again, while they do talk and they can be deeply intertwined, they also can be very different things. So Azure AD Identity Protection, that's for cloud environments. That's just cloud environments. Defender for Identity is something that's for hybrid environments, where your Active Directory has some kind of ADFS connection with Azure AD, and you would get Defender for Identity by installing an agent on your domain controller, wherever it sits, and it's collecting that information and sending it up to the Azure infrastructure, the cloud. So some of the things you can expect to see out of identity and access are anomalous IP address, malware-linked IPs, unfamiliar sign-in properties, password sprays or leaked credentials. On the security monitoring, this is more like reports, things that it will the product will proactively review and send you reports of, anomalies, application reports. So if an application is suddenly using more resources than it has, maybe because it's mining Bitcoin, suddenly activity logs. So things that might be interesting in a forensic kind of case. Next slide, please. So secure the network is another point we're talking about. Again, there's like two specific products today. Microsoft is calling them Defender for Endpoint and Defender for the Cloud. Defender for Endpoint is what we commonly recognize as Microsoft Defender. This is the Endpoint Agent, the product that lives on Windows 10. It's been available for Mac and Linux for a little over a year now. It's a little bit better for Mac today than it was even a couple months ago, a little bit better for Linux than it was a couple months ago. Windows 10 is solid. And that's going to send all of its alerts and detections to the Security Operations Dashboard, now known as Security Center. And again, this is where some of the name changing is taking place, where in the past, for Defender for Endpoint, you would specifically have to go to the Security Operations Dashboard. Today, that the label on the page says Security Center. Also, if like in some environments, they're running a product called Microsoft Sentinel, and it can also send alerts to that as well. And that's where you would correlate events from even outside of Azure environments or Azure Defender or other environments. So if you had like CrowdStrike, you could get some of your info there. And then Defender for Cloud, that's going to be their overarching umbrella for everything defense related for Azure now. So they used to have a few different products that covered Azure and defense, MCAS for example. And now they're just like trying to, I think like if I was going to make an assumption, They had a bunch of different products. They had a couple of different security products, and now they're trying to bring them all under the same umbrella so that it makes sense, because it was kind of obnoxious beforehand. However, during this change, it's been a little bit of a learning process, figuring out what all they're bringing in under the same umbrella and what they're just going to decide to call different things. So Defender for Cloud, as the slide says, like scan container images, that can happen, protecting your Azure and AWS Kubernetes instances. So that would be like an MCAS connector, aka Defender for Cloud connector. And it will do built-in vulnerability analysis. Also worth mentioning that Defender for Endpoint now does some vulnerability management and security posture management. Next slide. And so centralized visibility and preventing the attacks. So how are you going to know that this stuff is happening? So as I said, Azure Security Center is probably the place where most people are going to go. I don't know a lot of people, organizations that are using Azure Sentinel. There are some, but most are Azure Security Center, and that's coming default with, I think the lowest level you get that is E3. Could be wrong about that. Maybe Mike can correct me if I am. Certainly E5, that's where we've been playing with most of our clients, and some E3. But Azure Security Center is where all those Defender for Endpoints alerts are going to go, your Defender for Cloud, your Defender for AD or Identity. All of that stuff is kind of decentralized right in there. And so if you were just going to do a Microsoft Azure shop, like hybrid or cloud only or whatever, that would probably be your one-stop shop for security monitoring. You could also set it up that way if you wanted to be a multi-cloud environment, and there are ways to connect up other services like Google and AWS and others to send their events or their security events to Azure. I'm not going to get into that here, just know that it's a thing.
And hey, Jeremy, and Darian says, don't forget about Azure Lighthouse when you have anything more complicated than a single subscription.
Yeah, right. Yeah, thank you. So services to get some of this stuff, Graph API is like, it's not the central source of truth, but it's like it's an API exposing almost all of your Office and Azure services. So what we found is that Graph API doesn't always contain everything that we would need from a specific product, like Defender is the one that I've been spending the most time in, but it has most of it. But it's also going to have a lot of the information from Defender for Cloud and whatnot. So that can be like almost like the simpler way to connect up to your Azure environment. And I think my video froze. I don't know if Jake cares about that or not.
No, we can see you.
Oh, okay, cool. It froze on my screen. Okay, so, and then data via a REST API. So another place that we've been spending a lot of time on our blue team side is getting really familiar with the REST APIs associated with Azure, and specifically Defender for Endpoints. So like Azure Security Center allows you to run threat hunting queries. For example, it has some that it has a lot actually that are built in. You can run those through the Azure Security Center. You can also pass those queries over via an API call and return the results. So you don't actually have to go to the Azure Security Center dashboard to get that information. You can create those API calls, which of course like enables all kinds of other ways of messing with that data. All right, next slide, please. All right, so now I want to talk about the attacks. When we're talking about Microsoft Azure and attacking that, it like always comes down to credentials. And I say this on another slide, but at the end of the day, like it seems like most of the attacks right now are about credential management. So how do we look at that? Like most penetration testing services that we and others offer, there are a few different ways to attack Azure externally as an unauthenticated user. So just like Joe Public is out there trying to break into your stuff. Public resources, so looking at what kind of storage blobs is how Microsoft calls them, what storage blobs are open to public reading. Are there Is there code that's checked into like GitHub or GitLab or some other source code repository that has API keys? Can we steal those and use them for access? So that's like an external unauthenticated attack that's pretty common today. Internal, that's again kind of a lot like an internal pen test that we might do at an organization. But the difference is that our internal resource would be probably ceded access to another cloud VM or maybe provided credentials. So what happens if like we would be looking at, or the pen testing would be looking at, what does your Azure environment look like from the context of a compromised server, a compromised service, or a compromised user. And then internal API. So this is more specifically, what does your Azure security environment look like from the context of a compromised developer or somebody with privileged access? And if you have applications that you're building or that you're using, like assuming that one of those applications has been compromised, or that the credentials for one of those applications has been stolen, and then what does the security look like from the context of that application? Next slide, please. So like most pen tests, like this starts out with recon. I mean, it's always a situational awareness. What is out there? What resources do we have access to? What resources does the target have? What resources are they using? And there are a number of publicly available tools that allow you to see whether or not even a domain is using Office 365 or Azure or Outlook. Once you are able to get a user, or identify a user account, especially one with credentials, it's pretty trivial to do user enumeration, which then leads to password sprays. And then also looking at those public Azure blobs. So are there storage containers that we can get access to that maybe has things? So this is kind of not an exhaustive list of tools, but probably some of the top tools that we're going to be using when we're doing this reconnaissance work, trying to figure out like what's out there, what do we have access to? Next slide, Jake. So as I said before, attacks, it like almost always comes down to credentials. That seems to be like privileged access management is the thing today. A lot of the application level attacks that used to be the game 10 years ago are less so, especially when we're talking about a cloud environment. Microsoft might have a vulnerability in their software today, but it's really easy for them, I mean, like quote unquote easy for them to patch it, and then everybody is patched equally. Whereas like if somebody has like one of the ancient vulnerabilities like MS-08068 from 2008, Microsoft can patch it, and it might, and I've seen it take 10 years for an organization to finally get around and patch that vulnerability. So an application service vulnerability can persist in an on-prem environment in ways that it almost never persists in the cloud. Also, in an on-prem environment, we as attackers, penetration testers, we have a lot more access to the software that's running, and it's a lot easier to really put it through its paces, just like grind it up and figure out what all the vulnerabilities are. And we can spend days, weeks, months, years just like focusing on a specific suite of software and know that it's not going to change out from underneath us. Whereas Azure is quite a bit different. Like the industry is still trying to get its foothold in cloud environments. And while it's trying to get its foothold, it's all changing all the time and pretty rapidly. So it's a different environment. And today, the way that people are attacking is through privileged access. So what does that look like specifically? Password sprays. Like this is the classic and super common technique. If you don't know what a password spray is, it is rather than one user and multiple password attempts, which can lock out a user account after so many failed password attempts, we prefer to take all the users and try one password and try that same password, a common password for all the users. And that still works. That still works for a variety of reasons. And And even in environments that are using like Smart Lockout, Azure Smart Lockout, there's tools like Fire Proxy that will allow you to rotate your proxy that you're using in order to try those credentials. Azure privilege escalation. So this is, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more later, but this is really where auditing what your what users have access to and what they're allowed to do gets really important. And we've seen over the past 10 years where a tool like Bloodhound, or not even 10, it's more like 5, a tool like Bloodhound can really highlight where those relationships are between what users have access to what and what that means downstream. And only in the last year or so have we had tools that show us the same thing in Azure environments. Azure Container Registries, again, this is going to be looking for those credentials. And some of these attacks require that you've already compromised credentials. And so this can happen a number of ways, whether you break the application like through a SQL injection or some other kind of like application vulnerability, or you compromise credentials. So maybe it goes from an on-prem pen test and you're able to steal credentials and then you pivot into the cloud. And sometimes it's the reverse. Consent grant registered applications is where, okay, so you get an Azure registered application from the Azure repository. You go to run it in your environment. You grant it access to see the data in your environment. So maybe you're installing like the latest greatest firewall, and that application now has access to your data. So if it's an evil application, that evil application has access to your data. Microsoft Intune has been used to compromise environments. So again, that does require a global admin privileges or the privileges required to manage your corporate endpoint workforce or workstations. And if you're able to compromise that, then that effectively grants you access to every workstation in the environment. Compliant search is like an honorable mention. Again, like with the right credentials, that allows you to search through the entire O365 or Office or Azure environment for specific strings or words. So back in the day, a couple years ago, once you compromise like an admin level, once I compromise an admin level privilege, one thing that I might do is go to the Exchange server. I might go to a domain admin's email account, and I would start looking through their email logs to see like, are there occurrences of the word password or other sensitive information related to the engagement. And that would be part of the finding, or that might actually allow me access into other things that were not connected to Active Directory. Compliance search is like that, except instead of just for email, it's for everything. It includes everything in OneDrive, it includes everything in Outlook, it includes everything in SharePoint, like all of it. Which is great if you're an admin and you want to make sure that company secrets aren't leaving the company or people aren't talking about things they're not supposed to talk about. But if you're an attacker, it's also great.
Jeremy, and
yeah.
Forgive me, Depty, if I get your name wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Depty asks, well, he actually points out that there's also this like third-party connection attack due to unpatched apps and open ports. Part of that was kind of what you were talking about with using an application within the Azure environment. I think the more interesting aspect of that, though, is the shared responsibility model, where once you've loaded up a VM, you can load any frankly stupid piece of software you'd like on that, or configure it poorly.
Yeah.
And at that point, the cloud environment itself is not protecting you at all. Whatever you have loaded and the way you've configured it is 100% of the protection you have in place. Oh, and I got his name right. I got his name right. Yay,
you can.
Me.
Yeah. Well, next slide, Jake. So Yeah, you're right, Mike. Like you can load things up into Azure, and they can be completely without context. And I'll add like the instance metadata service. So when you start a VM in the cloud, every instance creates a new metadata service. So it's a non-routable IP address, and it's a website that you can go to, or like a web page, and it has a lot of the information about that VM, and it can contain access and secret keys depending on how you've deployed that or how you're using that system. So serverless environment variables, like again, this is like code management and again, like privileged access management. Azure AD user attributes, we see this a lot in on-prem environments where like maybe the help desk stores the password for an account, sometimes a service account within the comments or in some other attribute of the actual object, the user object. Yeah. So what we're seeing a lot of like out in the real world is hybrid environments. We're not seeing a ton of 100% Azure. What we're seeing is organizations extending their on-prem environment into the cloud. And especially like, today when so much of the workforce is remote, to using the ADFS. So what that creates is opportunities for us to pivot from a cloud environment like Azure. So doing something like a password spray to get a user account, and then using that user account to log into a VPN that's for the on-prem environment. And that then provides us internal access to the internal network. We're also seeing applications that are deployed incorrectly, meaning that there are like access keys hidden within the code itself or within the JSON that the system is returning. So that gives us access to the blob storage, or sometimes it gives us access to Azure objects itself. But mostly it's the hybrid environments that we're seeing. Okay, so next slide, please.
Before we do, Jim says you've mentioned ADFS in context of hybrid. Oops, just scrolled right by me. What about AD Connect for hybrid?
I'm not familiar with that one.
That's if naming here is the issue. I think that's the thing I just posted about, which is the sync capability with Azure AD and your on-prem AD. Yeah, DirSync.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating. I threw into the chat. I'm kind of interested in whether or not people on the call are using that. It's both an extraordinarily useful way to tie a hybrid environment together with a single source for information about authentication and authorization, but also, of course, a risk because you're extending both platforms into each other and increasing your threat profile.
And I think also worth calling out here, like Darian says that they've become a fully Azure shop, migrated local services there last year, products well developed and delivered there as well. So I asked folks if everybody was hybrid, and some folks said yes, some said no. And then Steve asked, don't most companies use multi-factor authentication to block the access in most instances? How would the attackers get past the access component when MFA is turned on?
Yeah, great question. So MFA by default, if you just like go deploy a new Azure subscription, MFA is going to be enabled by default. Those are like the security defaults that Microsoft gives you. If you disable those, which apply globally to your subscription, then you have to go and create the new policy that isn't the defaults. And often people will do that because there are instances like whether it's the CEO who hates MFA and like thinks it's stupid, so you have to make an exception for the CEO, or it's an application or some third-party service that's stupid that requires you to disable the MFA. But it also means you have to go and enable MFA for every user that isn't them. So it's an exception that you have to override. And then of course there's API keys. And sometimes access control is also based on user agent. So for instance, it's the case where maybe Android devices are exempted from doing MFA, or like old Android devices are exempted from doing MFA. But the way that Microsoft checks that is they check the user agent string. So it's a matter of like manipulating your user agent string as an attacker as Android, for instance, to see if you can bypass that MFA check. But in most cases, you're right. Like if it's up and running and it's working, MFA is great. Like 100% for MFA.
Yeah, my only exception to that is is the word most. What we see in the field, I think if you define most as more than 50%, maybe we're there. But we don't see MFA as well deployed as you might expect. There's a reason right now that if you're buying cyber insurance, one of the things the cyber insurance people are going to insist on and then verify, it's that you're actually using MFA as widely as you possibly can. So while we advise it in every case, when we test, we don't always see it.
No, and I mean, I'll add, I was talking actually to an organization yesterday, and at a law firm, and they have 3 partners who refuse to use MFA, and they're partners in the firm. And so, I didn't quite understand what they were saying, but now I do, about, turning off the global MFA just for these folks, and now it's off for everybody. And when they add new users, MFA isn't automatically turned on unless people turn it on. So, not to blame the CEOs in the room, because I know there are a couple, but if you're a CEO who made everybody turn off MFA, then, we are in fact blaming you. And then, Mike says, heck, we had a renewal decline due to not having EDR. So yeah, we're definitely seeing that too. Interestingly, on the sidelines here, if anyone wants to have an insurance discussion, I'm deep in the middle of all that, and what we've seen is, and this is not a sales thing, it's not a sales call, but deploying, our services with Defender for Endpoint has answered yes to the insurance questions, and just helped folks bring their rates down and actually get a renewal. Because as Mike points out, like if you don't have MFA and you don't have EDR, you're just not going to get your renewal. But that's a topic for another day. Jeremy, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, on Defender for Endpoint, I'll freestyle on that for a second. Defender for Endpoint, in my experience, is really good. It's a pain in the ass to bypass, and it's a pain. Like it's hard to disable on a Windows machine. Maybe not hard. It's difficult to disable on a Windows machine. It comes back on after you do disable it, and it's really good at detecting attacks, and it's constantly getting better. And then the actual information that it feeds back to the Security Center dashboard is pretty robust, and it allows you to run queries and perform isolations of machines to varying degrees. So in my experience, it's a pretty solid product, and it comes, like, if you're already running Azure, like O365 at a certain license level, it already comes with what you have, and it's deeply integrated into what you have. So it's good for me. I'm a fan.
So, and I do want to call it something that Mike Simon said in the chat here, which is important, which is, remember, Jeremy is attacking environments. So when Jeremy says something's a pain, that means that you should like it.
Oh, yeah. yeah. Sorry. I forget sometimes, like,
just remember who Jeremy
like,
is.
For me, I forget. I talk to so many of my conversations with fellow red teamers, like penetration testers, and so, like, we have a different perspective, like, very much so. Yeah, and Mike is right. When I say something is a pain in the ass, I mean, like, it makes my job harder to attack and, like, persist on networks. If I was a sysadmin, I'd be like, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I don't have to pay a bunch of money for it. It works pretty damn well. Like, it checks all the boxes. It does vulnerability assessments on the machines for me, lets me know when machines are out of their patch cycle. It tells me if that impacts the risk factor, like if other attacks have been occurring on the thing and it's vulnerable to things, that informs it. I like it as a sysadmin.
Yeah. Yeah. Just don't get Jeremy started talking about how fun it is to attack your system when you've named your system using 16-bit characters. That's a completely different topic.
So
Yeah,
and Jeremy, one person just emailed me this question. Defender for Endpoint is good. Are there without saying, hey, here are all the EDR solutions you like? Is Defender for Endpoint your top, and there are others that are up in the top tier? Their question was really, which do you not like? But I'm trying to save you from that question.
Yeah, CrowdStrike's doing pretty good these days from what I hear. I'm not out in the field as much as some of my team, but I know CrowdStrike, they're all like the big name vendors are right now, I think, for some good reasons. They're doing pretty well. Like when I have to go and find a random out of patch cycle Windows 10 or Windows 7 box still on the environment just so that I don't have to deal with the EDR that's inevitably installed on a thing, then the EDR is doing its job. When I have to get Python to execute my malicious code because everything else is getting shut down, I have to go find that one random box on the network that has the EDR is doing its job, which is kind of the whole point behind all of this, is having really good effective monitoring, knowing what's going on in your network, knowing what you have, knowing where your vulnerabilities are, watching those vulnerabilities like a hawk, and the minute something fishy starts to happen, go do something about it. And that's the secret. If there's a secret in this industry, that's what it is know what you have, watch what it's doing, especially the things that are really vulnerable. And when they start to do something weird, go check it out.
Yeah, and then a question came up here also from Michael. We have Defender for Endpoint deployed. Are the default settings adequate, or does it need to be tweaked to be useful?
No, I think default's fine. Yeah, I don't know anybody that tweaks Defender. I mean, I've tweaked I've tweaked Defender to tell it to stop scanning a bunch of folders because it was finding all of my malware and submitting it to Microsoft and then VirusTotal. But those are the only tweaks I've ever done to Defender.
Yeah, and so two things there. One in the chat and one one thing to note there, because it also came up in the chat a little bit. So, Defender, so EDR is endpoint detection response. So that is the detection and response there is that the endpoint you have will detect and respond on its own. It's different than managed endpoint detection and response, which is part of what we do, which is the SOC helps monitor your Defender instance or CrowdStrike or whatever. So the layer on top of there is the managed endpoint detection response. That's different than endpoint detection response. The other thing is Mike says, Defender and Defender for Endpoints are still separate things, right? The answer, Jeremy, is sort of, right? Defender for Endpoint used to be called Defender ATP. What was it?
Oh, yeah. Defender for ATP.
Right.
Yeah, so strip Defender out of it. There's the cloud and there's the endpoint. Defender applies to both, but they're different products. Defender for the cloud covers everything in Azure now, including MCAS and all of it. And Defender for Endpoint is strictly for your on-prem Windows, Mac, Linux devices.
And Microsoft is renaming all of their security stuff Defender. So Defender for cloud apps, Defender for this, Defender for that. The joke that I had going a couple weeks ago that did really well was that they've renamed Word Defender for grammar and Excel Defenders for addition. So there you go. All right, Jeremy, keep going.
Good one. Good job.
Thanks. I didn't come up with that.
You stole it. You stole the floor, Jake. It's yours now. more Jake jokes. Yeah. So next slide. I think I have one more. Do I? Yeah. So so what do we do about all this? So having an understanding of like what these different environments are in Azure and what some of these different things are, and maybe what the attacks are, we're looking at audit Azure in O365. So one challenge that's certainly has been a challenge for me is knowing what the hell is in Azure. Like it's 200 plus products. Which ones do I need to care about? Which ones are we actually using, and how are we using them? And I've felt like it has been more opaque than when, like years ago, I was a sysadmin and a database admin. Like I could go find the server that was the database server, and I knew like all database servers in the environment were here. But now, like the database server might be there, and then it might be gone tomorrow, and it might come back again. It's like all in code now. So, and also which database are we using? Because there's like several that Microsoft might provide for you, or different ways of storing and retrieving data. So, what are you using as an organization? Auditing that regularly, and then not just what are you using, but who has access to it and what kind of access do they have, and then understanding what the consequences of that are. So when you look at like, for instance, some people might put a backup domain controller in Azure, like as an Azure VM, and then have a connection to their on-prem network. So if you put that backup domain controller in the cloud and your devs have contributor rights to that same cloud environment, then those developers have access, like full access to that image, which means that they have full access to that domain controller, which effectively means that they have full access to domain admin credentials and privileges. So if an attacker is able to steal a dev credential, then and they have access to that backup DC, they now have domain admin, which is usually a bad day for most people. Compliance scanning. So like that tool that I was telling you earlier, like who's coughing up the secrets? Who's talking about what? Like who's sharing passwords? But also, what are your devices doing? Like not just your on-prem devices, but also your cloud instances. Do they match what you expect them to? Are they deployed the way that you expect them to? Or do your blob permissions match what you think that they should be? And are there downstream consequences for read or contributor or owner privileges on that object? Protect your credentials.
And hang on, real quick, Jeremy, before we get there, Ryan says, is this where PIM comes into play? Is this the same as conditional access?
I don't know how to answer that right now. Mike, do you have a?
Now, Ryan, could you give us more detail on what you're asking? I'm assuming you're talking about privileged information management. I'm not sure what the PIM in this case actually means.
All right, Jeremy, keep going. We'll get more from Ryan, and then we'll come back to it. Oh, Ryan says that's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, so I'll start. Jeremy probably has a lot to say on this. Essentially, yes. To the degree that you can manage access more granularly, and be able to sort of track that sort of thing, you can in fact not overprescribe. You can allow yourself to where am I going with this, Jeremy? You can create an environment in which least privilege actually applies as well as you possibly can make it apply. Yeah. So to that degree, yeah. But I'm not sure where you're going with the question, Ryan.
Well, as we get more, so Ryan, as you put more in the chat there, Jeremy, you were at protect your credentials.
Yeah. So like privileged identity management, that definitely applies. We don't want to, like, worst case scenario, and I've seen it, is you have 100 sysadmins who are all in the domain admins group. Like I couldn't even actually believe it. but it was true. So you want the opposite of that. You want like nobody or 2 accounts maybe to have that kind of privilege. And if those accounts do have that privilege, then like a solid privileged identity management solution you would check it out. You're allowed to use that for a while, and then it expires, and then you have to check out a new credential in order to do more work. And that keeps pretty tight rein on that credential. But there are almost always going to be exceptions, whether they're service accounts, like Exchange is a notorious violator of that, where Exchange has to have or like be inherited rights of domain admin so that it can do like password changes for any account, whatever. But it is a matter of least privilege at the end of the day. Like, yes, there will be some accounts that have to have like global admin or global owner privileges, but ensuring that as few accounts as few of those exist as possible. And then finally, monitor for suspicious behavior. Microsoft Azure gives you a lot of tools to monitor and track that environment. And it's also looking for that suspicious activity. It's either doing it on the fly as part of a regular detection, like unusual travel alerts, or it's doing it through reporting. So watching the behavior over time to see if there are dramatic changes. So Office 365 does this, for instance, when it notices that a user suddenly deleted a bunch of stuff, or a user suddenly did a bunch of stuff to a bunch of files. The same kind of thing exists for credential access. The same kind of thing exists for your resource management.
I wanted to dive in on the PIM stuff. Now that people have reminded me of what's going on with that, Microsoft went way down this path a long time ago. I remember a presentation from them in the corporate their corporate PIM years and years ago that was conditional access based on, for example, well, okay, this is a corporate laptop or not a corporate laptop, or this is a corporate laptop and you have the password for this user and you actually have a smart card installed in this laptop that, so on and so forth, where they're kind of cumulatively adding up all of what they know about you and granting access based on all of those things. It was an impressive presentation, and I know that Microsoft still uses a lot of that, but I haven't seen it a ton outside of Microsoft. So Michael Mall says actually they're using it. It's a tremendous idea, but I don't see it implemented a lot.
Yeah, I think another example of that is Red Forest, which was kind of the code name for that kind of architecture. And I think they kind of gave up on Red Forest. I think for most environments, it's too much work. I think it's like an unrealistic expectation for a lot of environments. And that's constantly the challenge in the security world, is balancing the usability versus security. And it sounds like a shitty bargain, but it's true. Like sometimes we go too secure, sometimes we make it too difficult. Like PKI is a pain in the ass, and so nobody uses it. It's like deployed basically nowhere because there are some key flaws in usability with it. But other solutions have come up, and we're like constantly trying to find the balance of how much work do we put into this? Like how much worth is it to do this versus what do we lose if we don't?
Cool. A real quickly answer to Mike Gunther. Yes, same concepts. Intune uses contextual information about the endpoint to give you better information about access levels and that sort of thing. So it's the broader implementation gets really complicated really fast.
Great. Jeremy, anything else on the slide?
No.
All right. So this is the part where we're going to do Q&A. I put our email addresses up on there, but we've been doing Q&A. Jeremy, I know you also look at, you look at AWS, you look at and on-prem networks. So how did the attacks in Azure differ from AWS?
Well, I think most dramatically, your Azure is more easily a hybrid environment with your Microsoft, like your on-prem AD environment. Like you can pretty easily connect your on-prem AD to Azure, and now, boom, you're in the cloud. All the same user accounts work. Everybody, if you're doing O365, everybody gets a OneDrive. Everybody's using Word. Like everybody's all connected to the same stuff.
I would add to that too. Even people using lots of different cloud environments, often because of that kind of ease of use aspect for the Office products, and and Windows prevalence on the desktop, you often have a lot of credential management happening in the Azure environment, whether or not you're using some other cloud. So, as a credential store, it gets a lot more use than pretty much any other cloud environment.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, I'm not an advocate for Microsoft in this case, but it's like Microsoft's products are just way more connected with Azure. Just like Apple, like a MacBook, you have to have an iTunes account, and then if you do have an iTunes account, or not an iTunes, but an iCloud account, everything's connected. Like everything works, and it's kind of the same with Azure. Like so everything in Azure can be controlled using PowerShell, which is their language. And then even when you log into your servers, they're going to be connected to Azure in some way if you choose. And then they can all be controlled through, like it's all intertwined.
And how do our security operations centers, view threats and report them in Azure, and how is that different than how they report them other places and view them?
Well, I think in the case of Azure, we're getting a lot of native detections versus like native detections backed by whatever Microsoft baked on their end. So like, for instance, it might be a malicious IP address. Like Microsoft has identified an IP address as malicious, and now they're flagging the traffic as potentially malicious. And so we get that first order detection from them, and then we're talking to a client about it. In other cases, we're having to do that work on our side, figuring out who the malicious IP addresses are, curating that list and keeping it fresh, and then alerting our customers when something bad happens. So I think in the case of Azure, we're getting a lot of the native detections that we're able to like deconflict, sort through, and ensure that they're not a false positive like we had last week, like the, what was it, Emotet false positive that started popping for like almost everyone. So rather than being bombarded with dozens of emails and thinking that you're like being mass pwned, we're able to capture those and realize pretty quickly it's a false positive, and stop worrying about it.
And for those of you unfamiliar with that, we even heard of a university that told everyone there was a giant attack, everybody log off for 24 hours while they figured out what happened there, and it was a Microsoft mistake. Sorry, I was interrupting you, Mike. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the other aspect of that kind of tightly integrated ecosystem that Microsoft runs with their desktops and Azure is actually we're able to often do a better job of pinning down inventory-wise if it's an endpoint, what that endpoint is. If it's registered in the Azure ecosystem, it's got an identifier in that ecosystem, and that's a well-known aspect of how you're interacting. So whereas a random laptop sitting on a LAN at the corporate network, as you all know, may not have as complete of an identifier available. It's a laptop, and we've got an IP address. Hopefully, you have a MAC address. We can maybe tell you who was logged into it, but it doesn't identify itself in the same way outside of an Azure ecosystem.
And a question that came up from the audience earlier was, when you were talking about hybrid versus, having everything all in Azure, and I think one person in the audience said that they have everything in Azure, it sounded like you said, if it's a hybrid environment, it's easier to launch attacks through an on-prem environment than an Azure environment. And so are you suggesting people move to an all Azure environment if they have anything in Azure, because it makes them more secure than having on-prem?
That's an interesting question. Would you be more secure? Huh. I mean, my instinct tells me I want to say yes. I think it's unrealistic. I think there's too much on-prem for most. Like a hospital can't move full. Like they're always going to have on-prem devices. Have to. That's a good question.
It's it's one we resolve ourselves in terms of our security operations center. You know, the machines that we want to be most secure, we've moved into the cloud essentially. In a highly protected environment. You have to access it from a piece of hardware that's sitting in front of you, obviously, but we have greater control. We have the ability to destroy, wipe, rebuild, revisit, patch in a much better way in the cloud. I wouldn't do a blanket statement saying, "Oh, it's just move everything into the cloud," though. That's just
right.
It's not just unrealistic. I don't think it's a good application of risk management.
And I think I think it's too much of a blanket. Like, is Mac or PC better? Because even in the cloud, we're still seeing the same problems. Like users have more access than they need. Services are misconfigured in a way that opens up vulnerabilities. There are still vulnerabilities that are really opaque to understand and discover without special tools. I don't think, or if you're like even in situations where you're doing like a remote desktop solution, there are ways to deploy that could leave you vulnerable, or that could open up new vulnerabilities, especially if you're not patching them. Like if you've deployed from a golden image, like some people might do. I think there are ways of deploying a cloud environment that are just as bad as any on-prem, or potentially worse. And of course, there's ways to deploy a cloud environment that would be better too. It's just a matter of like how to do it.
Well, Jonathan asks a question that would take us another hour or two, or maybe the next quarter of the year to really respond to. I can say, and so I'll respond to a piece of this. So, you're essentially, there's a paragraph here on, Microsoft is both the arsonist and the firefighter in every case where their stuff is on fire. I tell my development team constantly, please produce please produce code without bugs. And in fact, that's as a CTO, I come to them and I say, that's a bug. Why did you write that? I'm kidding. It is actually impossible to create complex systems that are perfect. We've never done it as a human species. So, jumping onto their, onto Microsoft with, your stuff doesn't work very well. It's crappy. And, here you are charging us to help make it secure. I'm not sure I would go there. I do believe I've worked with Microsoft, full disclosure, I worked with them quite a bit in the past. They were a customer of mine when I was a private consultant. I would give them the benefit of the doubt that they're trying their best to produce bug-free code that does not have vulnerabilities. Given that, yeah, they're still going to charge you. I wish their security services were free. In fact, that is something I blame them for. I wish they would provide the security aspects of Azure to everyone, just as a default. Here it is, it's part of your service. But I don't think you can jump on them for creating the bugs in the first place.
And Mike, let me steal the floor from you here. So just as we come up to time here, a couple of quick things. Number one, I said that there was a survey. The link is in the chat. You can trust it because it's a Microsoft form. Said with irony, these are the services we provide. Up here is where it says cloud. So we do 24 threat detection and response for Azure, which I'm the marketing guy, so I have to say. Also, one of the things we do, and we started doing the pandemic, was we used to charge for this, but at no cost. We do a 60-minute assessment. So if you need something real quick, if you go into the survey, there's a place where you can ask for this, or you can just email me, jake@criticalinsight.com, and I'll help you out with that. And one last thing is we do security awareness training every other Friday. There's one last one for the year. Email me, jake@criticalinsight.com. You can send anyone from your organization. We've had professors, we've had pen testers, we've had everybody come. And so definitely invite you to come to our other events. And that's the next one. As we come up to time here, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining. Special thanks to Jeremy for coming up with the idea for this and putting it together. Jeremy, thank you very much. Mike, thanks for being here and providing the extra wisdom and putting on the better headset so we could hear you. And everyone else, thank you. Have a good holiday season. If you need anything, let us know. And please, take that survey. Remember, one of the people is going to get a sweatshirt, which I'll remember to do because, as I said, I came up with that 4 minutes right before this webinar, so it's important. All right, everybody. Thanks. Have a good day.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.